Behringer have just released version 1.0.6 of the firmware for the MS-1 MK2. So what, I hear you cry? Well, here's what. In their teaser video for the firmware, it appears that they have fixed the glide or portamento issues which have been driving people wild or making them avoid this brand new synth. This morning then, I got onto the Synth Tribe app and followed the very basic process to update the firmware over USB. In under 5 minutes I had it up and running with the latest firmware. So first off, I decided to determine whether the glide function would work with the arpeggio running, and lo and behold it does. It works really well. Not only do you get a nice bit of glide coming in subtly when you hit the 25%ish mark, it runs over the arpeggio. Now in the previous version of the firmware, which is version 1.0.2, no matter what you did with the arpeggio, you couldn't get the glide to function whatsoever. It was just not an enabled feature. So Behringer have definitely fixed this feature or flaw, whichever you want to call it. For me, that shows that they've been listening to people's concerns and they've addressed some of the bigger issues apparent on this little synth. The other thing I can tell from doing this very basic test is that as I turn the dial up very gently, the glide introduces in a far more gradual, natural and organic fashion. So that was my main concern with the glide and portamento, because personally I tend to sequence this synth externally and I'm not sure I'll use the arpeggio function that much. However, I will use the glide, and having finer control over this function, especially towards the low end of the dial, is really great news, and for me it was worth the 5 minutes I invested in getting the firmware updated. The good news doesn't end there, because this function also works, that is the glide function also works over a sequence that you program on the synth. It behaves in the same way as the arpeggio function, in that if you program a sequence and have it running, you can turn the dial to get the amount of glide or portamento that you want applied. Apparently you can also apply glide into the sequence part, into the sequencer, and you do that by pressing hold whilst you're programming a note. Now, I'm not 100% sure how that works. I couldn't quite fathom it out ahead of doing this video, but I'm confident that's just me and not anything to do with the functionality that's been introduced into the new version of the firmware. One area I did find that was an interesting, shall we say, glitch, is that the arpeggio didn't want to behave normally when I had a MIDI device plugged in. Now, it may well be that the sequencer I'm using is trying to send MIDI clock data to the synth, and I think for some reason this current version of the firmware that was confusing it. So what I found worked for me reliably is within the Synth Tribe app to go and change the clock source to internal and make sure not to have a USB cable plugged in. Moving away from glide, the other main feature of this firmware is one where you can have an external sync going into the synth, and that external sync can then control the rate at which the random modulation takes place. So you can synchronize your random modulation to an external clock source. I tried very quickly to get that synced to a Novation circuit tracks and it didn't work, but again, it's kind of not something that's terribly important to me at this point in time, and I trust that it can function properly. I didn't spend a lot of time on this and will probably come around to trying different trigger and clock sources in the future to get this up and running. That's something I'm going to play with in the future. So all in all, this is a worthy update which addresses many of the main criticisms of the MS-1 Mark II original firmware, and being as I already own the synth, I'm happy to report that one of my minor grumbles has been fixed, and that is the glide sort of jumping in at sort of 10 to 15%, and the other things around the arpeggio and sequencer will be important to others. Now, it's good to see that Behringer are taking time to address these issues before the synths are more widely available. Unfortunately, at the moment, the MS-1 Mark II appears to be sold out at most places, although I'm sure matters will change over the next few weeks and months, and more people will be getting their hands on these. So what do you think? Does this fix your concerns about the synth? Are there other problems that you feel need addressing, or is there something else you don't like about the MS-1 Mark II? On Facebook, there are people commenting about wanting there to be different colour options, but personally I've lived with the red for a little while now, getting on for a month, and it's not as vibrant as some of the photos make out it to be, and so I'm finding it's actually settling quite nicely within my home studio. If you like watching Behringer videos and want to know more about what I think about the MS-1 Mark II, then watch this one over here.